My son sent me to prison for 2 years, blaming me for his wife's miscarriage. It was a crime I never committed. Every month they came to visit me behind the glass partitions, acting like a loving family. Every month I refused to see them. Today is the day of my release. They think they are picking up a broken old man who has lost his mind. They are wrong. The day of my release will be the very day they lose everything. I am Clifford Drummond, 72 years old, and for the last 730 days, I was known only as inmate number 8. The heavy steel gate slammed shut behind me, and the sound of it rang out like the sweetest note I'd heard in decades. 8 in the morning, yet the sky hung bruised and purple above me. Rain was coming down in sheets. Cold, sharp, real rain. Nothing like the damp, stale air of the cell block I'd been breathing for 2 years. I pulled a long breath into my lungs. Wet asphalt and diesel fumes. To me, it smelled like freedom. I looked down at my clothes. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where patience wins and the truth always finds its way home. Before we get into today's story, I want to hear from you. Drop a quick comment and let me know. Is this your first time sitting down with us? Or have you been along for the ride for a while? Either way, I am glad you are here. A quick note before we begin: some elements of this story have been shaped for the purpose of storytelling, and any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the message at the heart of it. It was the same navy pinstripe suit I had worn the day of the trial, the day the judge pounded his gavel and stripped my life away. Back then, that suit had felt like armor. Now it hung from my shoulders like a shroud, 30 pounds gone. The prison food was wretched, but it was the rage that truly ate through me. Rage burns more calories than any workout. I stood on that sidewalk holding nothing, no bag, no belongings, just the clothes on my back and a fire burning low in my gut. I spotted them before they spotted me. A gleaming black Rolls-Royce eased up to the curb and threw a puddle of filthy water across my shoes. Subtle, just like my son. The rear door swung open and Beckett climbed out. My son, my only child, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike, the man who had stood before a judge and called me a violent monster. He had on a Navy custom-made suit that probably cost more than the prison guard made in a year. He straightened his tie and smiled not at me, but at the cameras. I hadn't noticed them right away. The paparazzi, 3 or 4 of them lurking near the parking lot entrance, tipped off by Lacey. No question, they were there for the photo. The devoted son collecting his disgraced father, a tidy redemption arc to soothe the shareholders and prop up the stock price. Beckett moved toward me, arms spreading wide for the lenses. It had the look of a real embrace, a son welcoming his father home. He pulled me in. I stood stiff as a figure carved from stone. His hand hit my back, hard, too hard. He pressed his cheek to mine, his breath carrying mint and expensive coffee. "Smile, Dad," he breathed against my ear. Low clip, nothing the cameras could catch. "Don't stand there looking like a convict. The shareholders are watching. Stock drops 1 point because of the way you look, and I cut your commissary fund to nothing." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet pavement ahead. Then Lacey appeared. My daughter-in-law, the mistress turned wife. The woman behind every move in this nightmare. She stepped from the car as though she were stepping onto a runway. Flawless blonde hair, flawless makeup, and cradled in her arms, a bundle wrapped in blue cashmere. Her heels clicked sharp against the wet concrete as she approached. Her eyes were bone dry, but her face wore a mask of carefully rehearsed concern. "Look who's here, Clifford," she cooed, her voice like syrup cut with poison. "This is little Rex, your grandson. He's been so eager to meet you." She pushed the bundle toward my face. I looked down. The baby was asleep, innocent, oblivious to the fact that he was being used as a prop in somebody else's theater. I looked at him, and then I looked at Lacey. Behind all that foundation, I could see the fear. She held the boy out, waiting for me to take him, waiting for the shot of the remorseful grandfather cradling the new heir. I didn't lift my hands. I kept them buried in my pockets. I looked straight through her as though she were made of smoke, as though she weren't there at all. I stepped around her without a word. The smile cracked at the edges. The cameras went wild, snapping the snub from every angle. Beckett moved to block my path. His face had gone crimson. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed between clenched teeth. "Get in the car. We have dinner arranged." I said nothing. I simply walked around him, eyes already fixed on a worn gray Buick sedan, sitting about 50 yards off. Leaning on it, holding a black umbrella, was Warren Colby, my attorney, my only ally. No flashy suit. He looked worn down, but he was there. Loyalty is a rare thing these days, rarer than gold. I heard Beckett's shoes splashing up behind me. He grabbed my arm. His grip was feeble, soft hands, the hands of a man who had never done a hard day's work in his life. "Dad, stop making a scene," Beckett growled. "You're embarrassing us. Get in the Rolls Royce." I stopped. I turned my head slowly and let my gaze drop to his hand on my sleeve. I didn't say a word, just looked. The weight of that stare made him pull back. He released my arm as though it had burned him. I faced forward and kept walking toward Warren. He opened the rear door for me. I settled onto the cracked leather seat. Old tobacco and paper. It smelled like safety. As Warren shut the door, I heard Beckett unraveling behind me. The composure was gone. The mask had slipped completely. "You're a crazy old man," he shouted, his voice splitting. "You have nowhere to go. The house is mine. The company is mine. You have nothing. Do you hear me? You are homeless." I watched through the rain-streaked glass as he stood there in his expensive suit getting soaked through. Lacey was tugging at his arm, angling her face away from the cameras. I leaned back and shut my eyes. "I'm not homeless," I murmured as the engine turned over. "I'm just on a business trip, and I'm coming to take it all back." The interior of the worn gray Buick smelled exactly as I'd remembered, old leather peppermint and the faint dusty trace of legal briefs that had lived in the back seat far too long. Warren Colby said nothing as he pulled away from the curb, navigating through the driving rain knuckles, pale against the steering wheel. I watched the side mirror. The gleaming black Rolls Royce and the cluster of reporters fell away until they were nothing but a gray smear against the prison walls. For the first time in 2 years, the air didn't taste of industrial disinfectant and despair. Warren cleared his throat. He looked older. The creases around his eyes had deepened, and the hair that had been salt and pepper when I went in was now nearly all white. I recognized that look. It was the look of a man who'd been holding back an avalanche with bare hands. "You look terrible," Warren said, his eyes catching mine in the rearview mirror. "I feel fantastic," I lied. Every bone in my body ached, and the suit hung off me like it was draped over a frame, but my mind was clearer and sharper than it had been in years. Prison does that. It peels away everything that doesn't matter. No golf rounds, no board meetings, no charity galas. Just time. Time to think, time to hate, time to plan. "Tell me the damage," I said, cutting to it. Warren exhaled slowly. He reached into his briefcase on the passenger seat and drew out a thick manila folder, passing it back without turning around. "It's bad," he said quietly. "Worse than we expected." I cracked it open. The pages were covered in red ink. My finger moved down the list of assets that were no longer mine. The Wisconsin Lake House gone, sold 6 months back for half what it was worth. My vintage watch collection, 40 years in the building, auctioned off to cover what Beckett had labeled operational expenses. The employee pension trust I had established drained dry. "He's bleeding the company out," Warren said. "He sold off the logistics fleet in the Southern District, outsourced the trucking to a third-party vendor, a vendor I should mention that belongs to one of Lacey's cousins." A cold fury settled into my chest, quiet and still. I didn't let it show. I turned the page. "What about the headquarters?" I asked. "The downtown building." "That's all that's left," Warren said. "The crown jewel. He tried to move it last month to a developer out of Singapore, but the zoning laws you had put in place 20 years ago made it near impossible. He couldn't find a buyer willing to wrestle with the historic preservation restrictions." "Good," I murmured. "At least he's incompetent." Warren hesitated. The car slowed toward a red light rain, drumming steadily on the roof. "There's something else, Clifford," he said, and there was a tremor in his voice. "Something I learned 3 days ago. Beckett was desperate. The crypto market collapsed last week. He lost millions of the company's operating cash. He needed liquidity, fast payroll to cover creditors circling." I closed the folder. I could already see where this was heading. "Who did he borrow from?" I asked. "A private equity outfit," Warren said. "A shadow lender calls itself Nemesis Corporation. They are sharks, Clifford. The worst kind. They deal in distressed assets. They extended him a bridge loan of $12 million. The interest rate is predatory, practically criminal." I turned and looked out the window. The city rolled past, gray and soaked, and I asked about the collateral, though I already knew the answer. Warren tightened his grip on the wheel. Control, he said. He pledged his executive voting rights. Miss a single payment or let the company's credit rating slip below a C grade and Nemesis Corporation can seize his shares and assume immediate control of the board. He signed his own death warrant. Clifford, these people don't play games. If they move in, the company is finished. They'll tear it apart and sell the pieces. I settled back into the seat and let a small, dry smile find my lips. Warren caught it in the mirror, and his frown deepened. "Why are you smiling?" he asked, with something close to offense in his voice. "Did you hear what I just said? Your son handed the keys to your kingdom straight to a pack of corporate raiders. We need to file an injunction. We need to find a way to retire that loan before the first payment comes due next week." I let out a low chuckle, rough and rusty like a door that hadn't been opened in years. "We'll do nothing of the sort," I said. Warren hit the brakes as the light went red. He twisted around in his seat to face me, shock plain across every line of his face. "Have you lost your mind?" he demanded. "If Nemesis takes over, your legacy goes with it. The company you built from nothing, a single truck, it disappears." I leaned forward and rested my arms across the back of the front seat. "Warren," I said, keeping my voice low, "who do you think owns Nemesis Corporation?" Warren stared at me. He blinked. "I don't know," he managed. "It's a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork is buried under layer after layer of anonymity. It's impossible to trace." "Not impossible," I said. "Just difficult." I reached into my pocket and drew out a small crumpled scrap of paper, a commissary receipt from the prison with a row of numbers written across the back. Account numbers. 2 years is a long time, Warren. You brought me books. You brought me legal pads. But you also brought me access. Do you remember the forensic accountant you hired for my appeal? Warren's eyes went wide. "I had him set up Nemesis Corporation 6 months ago," I went on. "I liquidated my offshore accounts, the ones Beckett never knew existed. The emergency fund Rosalind and I put away for a rainy day." I looked out at the downpour beyond the glass. "It appears to be raining?" "You," Warren breathed. "You are Nemesis." I nodded. "I am the shark, Warren. I handed my son the rope he'll use to hang himself. He believes he borrowed money from some faceless corporation. He has no idea it came from the father he betrayed." Warren sank back into his seat and released a long, unsteady breath. He looked shaken, and for a brief moment I felt a flicker of guilt. Only a flicker. "So," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we hold the debt. We control the loan. We could call it in tomorrow, walk into that boardroom and tell him it's over." I shook my head. "No, not yet." "Why wait?" Warren asked. "Because pain teaches," I said, turning back to the rain-streaked window. "And Beckett hasn't learned a thing yet. If I move now, he'll cast himself as the victim. He'll say it was a rough quarter that the markets turned on him. He needs to feel secure. He needs to believe the money from Nemesis saved him." I paused, watching a raindrop trace its way down the glass. "Let him spend it, Warren. Let him buy Lacey another diamond necklace. Let him think he's won." I let the silence sit for a moment. "Let him climb higher. Because the fall only kills you when you fall from a great height. When he feels untouchable, when his arrogance peaks, that's when we trigger the default clause. That's when I take it all back." Warren turned back to face the road. The light went green. He put the car in gear, but his hands weren't quite steady. "You are a frightening man, Clifford," he said. "I was a decent man once," I replied. "But decent men don't make it through prison, and they certainly don't survive this family." I closed my eyes and let myself picture the expression on Beckett's face when the hammer finally dropped. It would be devastating. It would be necessary. A surgeon doesn't apologize for cutting out a tumor, and Beckett, my own son, had become one slowly killing everything I'd built. "Where to?" Warren asked, his voice settling back into its professional register. I opened my eyes. The fire in my chest was burning steadily now, hotter than before. "Take me home," I'd said. "Take me to the mansion. I want to see what they've done to my house, and I want them to see that the ghost has come back to haunt them." Warren nodded and eased onto the highway. The wipers swung back and forth like a metronome, counting down the moments until the war began. I was no longer just an ex-convict. I was Nemesis, and Judgment Day was on its way. The iron gates of Drummond Manor rose before us like the jaws of some enormous beast. I had put those gates up 30 years ago to hold the world at bay, to shield my family. But as Warren brought the car to a stop in front of the call box, I understood that the beast was now keeping the monsters inside safe from me. The rain had intensified, hammering the roof in a relentless rhythm. I looked up at the stone pillars. My initials CD were still cut into the granite, but I knew that within those walls every trace of my name had been erased. Warren rolled his window down. Cold air flooded in. He pressed the intercom button. Silence. He pressed it again. A crackle of static. Then a voice I didn't recognize. Hired muscle. Private security. "I state your business," the voice snapped. "This is Warren Colby, legal counsel for Clifford Drummond. Open the gate." A pause, heavy, deliberate. Then the voice came back thick with contempt. "Mr. Drummond doesn't reside here anymore. We have standing orders. No trespassers. Turn the vehicle around or we contact the authorities." I felt a muscle twitch in my jaw. I pushed my door open and stepped out into the rain. Warren called after me. I didn't look back. I moved to the pedestrian entrance, a smaller gate set into the wall, and pressed my thumb to the biometric scanner. I had built this system myself, calibrated it to read my print in under a second. I held my thumb to the glass and waited for the green light. A harsh red light blinked back at me. Access denied. I pressed again harder. Access denied. They had deleted me. My own home where I had raised my son, where I had sat with my wife through her final days, was rejecting me like a foreign body. I stared at that red light with rain running down my face, and for a moment, the fury was so absolute I nearly ripped the scanner from the wall with my hands. Then the sirens hit. Close. Far too close. Lacey must have had her phone in hand the moment she saw our car turn onto the private road, watching from some upstairs window like a spider at the center of her web. Blue and red strobed across the wet asphalt as two patrol cars skidded to a stop behind Warren's Buick. Doors burst open. 4 officers climbed out, hands resting near their holsters. I turned to face them slowly. I knew how this worked. I had learned it the hard way 2 years ago. Move deliberately. Keep your hands where they can see them. Say nothing until spoken to. It's step away from the gate, the lead officer shouted, young, edgy, and dangerous for it. Hands in the air, now! I raised my hands unhurried. The rain soaked through my shirt, cold against my skin. "I am not armed," I said, my voice level against the raging storm inside me. "This is my house." We received a 911 call reporting an attempted break-in and violation of a restraining order. The officer barked, closing the distance. "Turn around, hands on the wall." I did as I was told. The stone was cold and rough against my palms. I looked up toward the house. The front door opened. Lacey stepped out onto the porch beneath the broad overhang. She wasn't performing grief now. She was pointing. "That's him," she shrieked, her voice slicing through the wind. "He's out of his mind. He threatened to kill us if we didn't let him in. He's dangerous. Arrest him." And then above her on the second-floor balcony, the French doors swung open. Beckett stepped out. He had a crystal tumbler in one hand, swirling the amber liquid with casual ease. He looked down at me, pressed against the wall of my own home by 4 officers, and he smiled. A smile of pure, uncut triumph. "Get rid of the trash, officers," Beckett called down from the balcony, his voice carrying a slight slur. "He's on private property, and he's a convicted felon. We don't feel safe in our own home." The officer yanked my wrist up behind my back. I felt the cold bite of the handcuff graze my skin. That metallic click, it was the sound of my nightmares. I shut my eyes. Was this how it ended back in a cell before I'd spent a single night as a free man? "Wait." Sharp, authoritative. Warren stepped out of the car, hoisting a binder above his head, indifferent to the rain destroying his suit. "Officer, if those cuffs go on him, you'll be staring down a lawsuit for wrongful arrest and civil rights violation before sunset." The officer froze one cuff already dangling from my wrist. He looked at Warren, then up at Beckett, then back at me. "Who are you?" he asked. His attorney, Warren said, moving forward with a calm authority that made the officers instinctively give ground. "And you are acting on false information. My client is not trespassing. He is home." Beckett laughed from above, a hollow, jittery sound. "Don't listen to him," he shouted. "I hold the deed. The title is in my name. I have the paperwork." He spread his arms wide. "That old man has no rights here." Warren didn't look up. He walked straight to the lead officer and opened the binder to a page flagged with a yellow sticky note, tapping the paragraph with one finger. "Read that," he said. The officer squinted against the rain lips, moving slightly as he read. Then he went still. He looked more closely. He glanced up at the house, then back down at the page. "What exactly does this mean?" "It's a life estate clause," Warren said, raising his voice just enough to carry to the balcony. When Clifford's late wife Rosalind Drummond transferred the property title into the trust that Beckett now controls, she included a non-negotiable stipulation, Clause 4A. Regardless of ownership title transfer or any familial dispute, Clifford Drummond retains the exclusive irrevocable right to occupy the primary master suite of this property for the duration of his natural life. That right cannot be severed by sale transfer or any court proceeding short of his own death. I lowered my hands. The officer didn't move to stop me. It means, Warren continued snapping the binder shut, that while Beckett may own these walls, Clifford owns the right to stand anywhere he pleases inside those gates. If you arrest him for trespassing, you are arresting a man for standing in his own living room. The silence that followed was dense, nothing but rain and a low roll of distant thunder. I turned my gaze up to the balcony. Beckett's smile was gone. He had both hands on the railing, gripping it as though the wood might keep him upright. Lacey had stopped shrieking. She stood on the porch with her mouth slightly open, frozen in place. "Officer," I said, brushing the water from my lapel. "I'd like to go inside and get dry. My son appears to have forgotten the gate code. I'd suggest you ask him to open it, unless you'd prefer I file charges for unlawful eviction." The officer looked at me, then at the document again. He unclipped the handcuff from my wrist. He looked irritated, not at me, but at the mess he'd been dragged into. He tilted his face up toward the balcony. "Mr. Drummond," the officer called out to Beckett. "Open the gate." "What?" Beckett shouted back. "No, he's dangerous." "The document is valid, sir," the officer said flatly, his hand resting on his baton. "Open the gate or we cut the lock and cite you for obstructing a resident's legal access. Don't make me come up there." Beckett slammed his glass down on the railing. It shattered, raining fragments down onto the patio below. He wheeled around and stormed back through the French doors, leaving them hanging open. A moment later, the red light on the scanner switched to green. The heavy iron gates groaned and began their slow swing inward. I gave the officer a single nod. "Thank you for your service." I walked past the security booth. The hired guard kept his eyes on his phone, suddenly very absorbed in it. I started up the long, curving driveway on foot. The landscaping had changed. My roses were gone, pulled out and replaced with sharp, angular hedges that felt cold and corporate. The stone bird bath at the center of the circular drive was cracked and overrun with weeds. Neglect was everywhere you looked. Beckett wanted the prestige of the mansion, but had no patience for the discipline of maintaining it. Warren pulled the car up behind me. I kept walking. I wanted to arrive on foot. I wanted them to hear my footsteps coming. I reached the front porch. Lacey was still there, arms folded tight across her chest, eyes moving restlessly, hunting for a new angle, a fresh weapon. But she had played her strongest card, and I had beaten it. I climbed the steps, 1, 2, 3. I stopped directly in front of her. She smelled of expensive perfume and something else beneath it. Fear? She tried to hold my gaze, tried to summon the imperious sneer she'd worn in the courtroom. It didn't come. Her eyes dropped. "You cannot stay here?" She hissed, her voice unsteady. "We will make your life a living hell. You'll wish you'd stayed in prison." I looked past her through the open front door. The foyer had been transformed. My antique Turkish kilim was gone, replaced by a stark white polished concrete floor that looked cold and absurd in a house this age. But what stopped me were the curtains in the grand salon. They had once been a warm, soft gold. Now they were heavy velvet dyed a deep, aggressive crimson. I turned back to Lacey. I leaned in close, just close enough to make her flinch. "I spent 2 years in hell, Lacey," I said quietly. "I found it quite manageable." I shouldered past her, catching her just enough to send her stumbling back on her heels. I stepped across the threshold. The air inside was warm but stale, the stillness of a house holding its breath. I turned back once more before pulling the door closed on the rain and the wreckage outside. "I notice you redecorated," I said, nodding toward the salon. "The curtains, you went with red." Lacey stared at me, hands clenched at her sides. "So what?" she snapped. I smiled. For the first time all day, it was a real one. "Good choice," I said. "The color of blood suits you." I turned and moved toward the staircase, leaving her standing in the doorway with the cold wind at her back. I was inside. The enemy was behind the walls. The hunt had begun in earnest. The silence of the manor was nothing like the quiet I remembered. This was a suffocating stillness, the kind that gathers in the air just before a tornado makes landfall. I moved through the hallway, my footsteps ringing off the marble. My shoes were still wet from the rain, leaving faint muddy smears across the polished concrete. I didn't care. I passed the living room and headed straight for the east wing, my sanctuary, my study, the room where I had built Drummond Logistics out of a single truck into an empire, where I had shared cigars with senators and signed contracts that reshaped this city's skyline. I reached the double oak doors, closed. I put my hand on the brass handle, expecting the familiar weight of solid wood pushing back. The door swung open far too easily, too light, too hollow. I stepped inside and went completely still. Gone, all of it gone. My mahogany desk, hand-carved in Italy, had been removed. The walls, which had once been hidden behind floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with first editions and legal encyclopedias, were stripped to nothing and painted a harsh clinical white. The smell of old paper and rich tobacco had been scrubbed out and replaced with the sharp sting of rubber and lemon disinfectant. Mirrors. They had lined every wall with mirrors. I stared at my own reflection, a gaunt, gray-haired man in an ill-fitting suit standing in the center of a nightmare. Where my leather armchair used to sit there was now a rowing machine. Where I once reviewed quarterly earnings, a rack of dumbbells stood alongside a purple yoga mat rolled out across the bench press. They had converted my war room into a gym, Lacey's gym. I crossed to the bench press and picked up the purple yoga mat. It carried her scent, cloying, aggressively sweet. I set it back down and dragged my hand across my leg. There was a burning pressure building in my chest, pushing up behind my eyes. This wasn't merely disrespect. It was erasure. They were working to carve me out of the history of this house entirely. I turned away from the mirrors. I couldn't stand to look at what had become of the room that once defined my authority. I needed to find my things, my books, my papers, but most urgently, Rosalind's portrait. It had hung above the fireplace for 20 years, an oil painting commissioned for our 30th anniversary. She was wearing her favorite blue dress, wearing that soft, knowing smile that had calmed my worst storms for decades. I looked at the fireplace. The space above the mantel was a white void. Cold panic cut straight through my rage. I ran from the room. I moved faster than my body had any right to, ignoring the grinding ache in my knees. I pushed through to the back of the house, past the kitchen, toward the servants' quarters and the storage rooms. If they had thrown my life away, that was where the wreckage would be. I wrenched open the maintenance closet door, dark inside, mildew and damp earth. I groped for the light switch. A single bare bulb stuttered to life, throwing long, restless shadows across the clutter. And there they were, stacked in the corner, like rubbish boxes of my files, my awards. The key to the city I'd been given 10 years ago lay face down in a puddle, fed by a leaking, rusted pipe. But the key wasn't what I was looking for. I plowed through the pile, shoving plaques and trophies aside. Then I caught the glint of a gold frame. I pulled it free. My hands were shaking. It was Rosalind, but the canvas was torn. A long scratch ran across her cheek, the kind you get from being dragged across a floor. The base of the frame was waterlogged, the wood swollen and beginning to rot. Mold had started to spread across the corner of her blue dress. I sank to my knees on the cold concrete. I pulled a handkerchief from my pocket and worked frantically to wipe away the grime and the mold. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice breaking in that empty room. "I'm so sorry, Roz. I should have been here. I should have protected you." I held the frame against my chest, rocking slowly. The rage that had been burning like a fire was turning into something else, ice, dense and unbreakable. They could take my money, they could take my company. But to treat the memory of the woman who had made this house a home like something to be thrown in a closet, that was not an oversight. That was a declaration of war. I stayed on that floor for a long time, cleaning every surface of the frame until it was as restored as my hands could manage. Then I stood composed. Myself straightened my tie. I lifted the portrait and walked back toward the main house. I would not leave her in the dark. She was coming back into the light. I carried the painting to the main living room and set it carefully on a side table, leaning it against the wall. I was just clearing a trace of dust from the glass when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate, arrogant. "Well, look who's making himself at home." I turned around slowly. Beckett stood in the doorway. He had changed out of his suit designer jeans now, a polo shirt pulled too tight across the middle, a glass of whiskey in one hand. I said nothing. I stood where I was in front of the portrait, shielding it. Beckett moved into the room, his eyes sweeping the space until they found the painting. He let out a short, contemptuous sound. "I thought we got rid of that old thing," he said, helping himself to a sip. "It clashes with the decor. Lacey hates it. It's depressing." "It's your mother," I said, quiet and level. "It's a dusty old picture. Beckett replied, flicking his hand dismissively. Fine, keep it. Put it in your room. Just keep it out of sight. We have guests tonight. Investors. Important people. I won't have them watching my father shuffle around the house like a senile janitor hauling junk. He reached into his back pocket and produced a money clip. He peeled off several bills and let them fall onto the coffee table between us. They drifted down like dead leaves. There, Beckett said, $500, your allowance for the month. Don't spend it all in one place. I looked at the money, then I looked at him. Allowance, I repeated. Yeah, he sneered. You've got no income, no pension. I froze your personal accounts. Remember, call it charity. Go get yourself a new shirt. That suit smells like the cell block. And tonight, do me a favor. Stay in your room. Don't come downstairs. Don't embarrass me. He was waiting for me to detonate, to shout, to fling the money back in his face. He wanted to prove I was the volatile, dangerous man he'd described to the judge. He wanted the scene. I breathed slowly. I let the muscles in my face go slack. I walked to the coffee table, picked up the bills, and counted them without hurrying. 500, I said. I looked up and gave him a small, tight smile. Thank you, son, I said. Very generous. Beckett blinked. The satisfaction drained right out of him. He'd lost the fight before it started. Yeah, well, he muttered, already turning away. Just stay out of the way. He walked out, drink in hand. I listened to his footsteps fade up the stairs. I looked at the money in my palm, $500, the price of his arrogance. I put it in my pocket. Thank you, son, I murmured again to the empty room. This will buy me a front row seat to your funeral. I turned my attention to the large oak desk in the corner of the living room. It was the only original piece of furniture they had kept, probably because it was too heavy to move. This was where Beckett now sat to sign checks he had no right to sign. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and drew out a small black device no bigger than a button. I'd acquired it through a contact on the inside, a man who had worked in intelligence before landing in cell block D. I knelt down and felt along the underside of the desk's heavy lip. I peeled back the adhesive and pressed the listening device firmly into the wood, deep in the shadows where no one would think to look. I tapped it once to confirm it was secure. Enjoy your party, Beckett, I said softly. Speak up. I want to catch every lie. I rose, collected Rosalind's portrait, and headed for the stairs. The money was in my pocket. The bug was in place. The game was afoot. I was no longer merely a guest in my own house. I was the spy embedded in the enemy's camp. Tonight I would listen. I spent the next hour in the guest bathroom, scrubbing the prison off my skin until it was raw. I shaved away the gray stubble and uncovered the sharp jawline that had given pause to union leaders and corporate raiders for 40 years. At the back of the cedar closet, still sealed in a garment bag that Lacey had apparently missed during her purge, I found it. My tuxedo. Bespoke, tailored in Milan 10 years ago. A little loose at the waist now, but with the right posture it didn't read as borrowed. It read as armor. I stood before the mirror. The man looking back was not inmate number 8. Not the broken father dragged away in handcuffs. He was Clifford Drummond, founder, CEO, Predator. I set my cufflinks gold knots I'd kept hidden in the toe of an old shoe. I checked the listening device in my breast pocket, then I opened the door. Downstairs, the house was humming, the low-layered sound of a jazz trio beneath the murmur of 50 voices, all trying to sound important. The catering reached me before I reached the landing, smoked salmon and creme fraiche, blini, the scent of money. I walked to the top of the grand staircase. Below, the foyer was packed with the city's elite, or at least those who badly wanted to be. I recognized several faces: hedge fund managers with shaky reputations, property developers with a long history of cutting corners, and there at the center of it, all holding court, was Beckett, laughing too hard, face flushed with expensive scotch. Lacey was on his arm in a red dress that matched the new curtains. A diamond necklace caught the light at her throat. My mother's necklace. A spike of adrenaline hit, but I pressed it down. Stay cold, Clifford. Stay cold. I started down the stairs, unhurried, one step at a time, my hand trailing along the mahogany banister. The conversation in the foyer didn't die all at once. It faded in stages. First the cluster near the staircase, then those by the front door, and finally Beckett himself. The jazz trio trailed off into an uneasy silence. Beckett stared up at me, his mouth hanging open slightly. He had the look of a child with his hand caught in the cookie jar. He'd told these people I was a senile invalid, an embarrassment warehoused somewhere out of sight. He had not braced them for the return of the man who built all of this. I reached the bottom step. The crowd parted on instinct, opening a path in front of me. I crossed to a passing waiter, lifted a glass of champagne from his tray, and tilted it slightly in my son's direction. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice carrying to the far end of the room without effort. "I hope you're enjoying my home." A few guests murmured stiff, awkward greetings. Beckett recovered first. He handed his drink to Lacey and came straight at me. A strained smile stretched across his face that never made it anywhere near his eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice pulled tight. "I thought you were resting. You know what the doctor said about your sleep." I took a sip. The champagne was cheap. Beckett was skimming on the catering as well. "I found my energy tonight, son," I replied, looking past him at the investors. "It wouldn't sit right with me to leave your guests unwelcomed. After all, I've been away on a government-sponsored sabbatical for quite some time." A nervous ripple of laughter moved through the room. Beckett seized my elbow, his fingers pressing hard into my arm. "Go back upstairs," he hissed. "You are ruining this." Before I could say a word, Lacey stepped forward. She had collected herself. She saw the investors watching, and she recognized an opening. She released Beckett's arm and moved toward me with a look of theatrical sympathy. She placed a hand on my chest, her fingers splayed like a spider. "Oh, Clifford," she sighed loud enough to carry across the room. "It is so brave of you to come down. We were just telling everyone how much you've been through since the incident." She let that word drift in the air. The incident. The polite term for the lie that had put me behind bars. The room went completely still. The investors leaned in, hungry for the story. Lacey turned to face the crowd, her eyes shimmering with manufactured tears. "You all know the tragedy our family endured," she said, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "When I lost the baby, it was the darkest of times. And poor Clifford here. His mind just broke. He didn't mean to hurt me. We understand that now. Prison was hard on him, but we're only glad to have him back where we can look after him, even when he gets confused." She patted my cheek with a slow, condescending hand. It was a masterclass in humiliation. In under a minute, she'd cast me as a violent, senile old man, and herself as the forgiving saint who had survived him. The investors nodded along sympathetically. They regarded me with pity. I did not pull away. I let her hand stay where it was. I held her gaze steady and unblinking. "You're right, Lacey," I said, my voice quiet and level. "My memory has been unreliable lately. Prison does that. You have so much time in there, so much time to go back over every detail, to replay it all." I took a step toward her, and she took one back. "But there's something I've been trying to piece together." I turned to address the room. "Maybe you can help me, Lacey. You were there after all." I let the pause sit. The tension in the air was thick enough to press against your chest. "That night on the stairs," I said, "when you fell and we lost, the baby, was it a boy or a girl?" Lacey froze. Her smile cracked. "What?" she stammered. "The baby," I repeated, all innocence. "I never saw the certificate. Beckett never told me." I looked around at the guests. Was I going to have a grandson or a granddaughter? Lacey glanced at Beckett. Beckett found something worth studying on the floor. It was a boy," she said quickly. "A little boy. We were going to name him after Beckett." She pressed a napkin to her dry eyes. "A boy," I said, nodding slowly. "That's beautiful. A son." I took another sip and set the glass down slightly. Strange, though. I reached inside my tuxedo jacket. I drew out a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't the original medical report, it was a laundry list from the prison, but I held it the way you'd hold a verdict. Because my lawyer sent me the records from St. Crispin's Hospital just yesterday. I said, dropping my voice by an octave. I wanted to arrange a memorial to pay my proper respects. But the pathology report from the night of the miscarriage doesn't mention a male fetus. I unfolded the page in a slow, deliberate pull. The soft rustle of paper was the only sound in the room. "In fact," I read aloud, "it states the patient was treated for a ruptured ovarian cyst. A painful condition, certainly, but not a pregnancy, and not a baby boy named Beckett." I looked up. Lacey's face had gone completely bloodless. She looked like a corpse dressed in red. The guests were trading glances. Whispers broke out across the room. A man near the back, a banker I recognized, frowned and turned toward Beckett. "What is he talking about, Beckett?" The banker pressed. "You told us the litigation risk was behind you. You told us the assault charge was airtight." Beckett panicked. His eyes jumped to Lacey, who was shaking her head in sharp, frantic movements. He looked back at the investors who were beginning to step away. "He's confused," Beckett shouted, his voice splitting. "I told you he's senile. He doesn't know what he's reading. That's probably a grocery list." He grabbed Lacey's arm roughly, nearly pulling her off balance. "Lacey is exhausted," he announced to the room. "The emotional toll you understand. She needs to rest. Dad, give me that paper." He lunged for it, but I drew my hand back. I folded the sheet with care and slid it back into my pocket. "Trauma is a terrible thing," I said coolly. "It makes people say and do the strangest things. Get some rest, Lacey. You look like you've seen a ghost." Beckett stared at me with naked hatred, but he was helpless. Not in front of the money. He steered Lacey toward the kitchen door and disappeared from his own party. I stood alone at the center of the room. The ring of people around me had grown wider. No one was looking at me with pity anymore. They were looking at me with something closer to fear, and looking at the door where Beckett had just fled with open suspicion. I raised my glass toward the banker who'd spoken up. "The smoked salmon and creme fraiche blini are excellent," I said. "But I'd keep my distance from the investment portfolio if I were you. The numbers are every bit as imaginary as my grandson." I turned and walked toward the buffet table. I didn't need to look back to know that the seeds of doubt had taken root and were already spreading. The party was effectively finished. The real show was only just beginning. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 2 in the morning. The sound rang through the silent house like a death knell. The last of the investors and hangers-on had stumbled out the door an hour earlier, leaving behind the ghost of stale cigar smoke and spilled wine. The house was quiet now, but not at rest. It was holding its breath. I sat on the edge of the guest bed in the dark, still in my tuxedo. I had not slept. Sleep belongs to the innocent, and I was neither innocent nor willing to be naive. In my hand I held the small receiver paired with the listening device I'd tucked under the desk earlier that evening. I adjusted the volume and fitted the earpiece in place. The feed was crisp and clear, picking up the refrigerator's hum in the kitchen, the measured tick of the clock. Then came voices. They were in the living room, exactly where I'd expected them to land. Beckett sounded drunk. His words ran together in a slurring, anxious rush. "He knows, Tiff. I'm telling you, he knows. Did you see how he looked at you? Did you hear what he said about the medical report?" The clink of a glass against a hard surface. Then Lacey's voice cut through the static, sharp and cold. She did not sound drunk. She sounded like someone running calculations. "He's guessing Beckett. He's throwing darts in the dark, hoping something lands. The medical report is buried. I paid the nurse to shred the hard copies. The digital file is encrypted. He has nothing." "But he has the dates," Beckett whined. "He has the dates wrong. He said the cyst surgery was 2 days before the fall." "So what?" Lacey snapped. "He's an old man who spent 2 years in a concrete box. No one believes him. You saw the investors, they think he's losing his mind. Stop drinking and pay attention." I listened as the leather sofa creaked. Beckett was pacing. I could picture him sweating, tugging at his collar the way he did as a boy whenever he'd broken something he shouldn't have. "We need more cash," Beckett said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "The loan from Nemesis. The interest payment comes due next week." I burned through the principal on the crypto margin call. "We're underwater, Tiff. If we miss that payment, we lose the voting rights." I leaned forward in the dark. There it was, the confession. "Then sell more shares," Lacey said, as casually as if she were suggesting takeout. "Sell the Asian distribution arm. We have an offer sitting on the table." "I can't," Beckett groaned. "That's the core of the business. If I sell that, Dad will—" "Dad has no say." Lacey cut him off, her voice sharpening. "Dad is a ghost. You are the CEO. And hear me clearly, Beckett. I need $50,000 by Friday." "50,000?" Beckett choked. "For what I just gave you 10 grand last week." "Rex needs things," Lacey said. Her voice had shifted entirely. Gone was the wife. What remained was something colder, the voice of a blackmailer. "The nanny needs to be paid. The private doctor needs to be paid. And I need security. If this ship goes down, Beckett, I am not going down with it. You better find the money, or maybe I'll take Rex and go stay with my brother for a while. You know how much the press would love a story about a single mother running from a bankrupt CEO." Silence. The threat settled over the room like something heavy and airless. She was using the child not as a son, but as a weapon. "Fine," Beckett whispered, broken. "I'll call the broker in the morning. I'll sell the shares. Just don't leave." I pulled the earpiece out. My hand was trembling, not from fear, but from a cold, razor-sharp fury. They were going to strip my life's work to the bone, feeding her greed and covering his failures. I got to my feet. The floorboards were cold under my bare feet. I had heard everything I needed to hear. The time for listening was over. Now came the hunt. I eased the bedroom door open. The hallway was swallowed in darkness. The only light came from the moon pressing through the high windows, throwing long skeletal shadows across the floor. I knew this house the way I knew my own breathing. I knew which floorboards sang underfoot. I knew which doors drifted open if you didn't latch them firmly. I moved without a sound, a ghost moving through my own home. I reached the top of the stairs and looked down into the foyer below. Empty. The living room was dark and still. Beckett had either collapsed on the sofa or dragged himself up the back stairs. But then I caught at a faint thread of light wavering in the hallway that led to my old study. Someone was in there. I went down the stairs, shifting my weight with care, keeping to the edges of the steps where the old wood held firm. I reached the ground floor and pressed my back flat against the wall. I waited. I listened. Click, 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 beep. A keypad. I moved closer. The study door sat slightly ajar. I put my eye to the gap. A flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, catching the far wall. The mirrors lining the room threw the light back in fragments, a disorienting web of reflections. And crouching at the center of it all was Lacey. She was kneeling before the wall where Rosalind's portrait usually hung. She'd moved the painting aside. Behind it, set into the wall, was my private safe, the one I'd had installed 30 years ago. The one that held not money, but secrets, deeds, original incorporation papers, the physical evidence of everything I'd spent years quietly gathering. She was hammering numbers into the keypad with frantic fingers. 1974, beep error. 1979, beep error. Damn it, she hissed through her teeth. She struck the safe with the flat of her hand. Come on, you old fool. What is the code? She was working through my birth year, then Beckett's. She had me pegged as sentimental. She thought I was the kind of man who used his son's birthday as a lock combination. I watched her in silence. She looked desperate, hair in disarray. The red dress gone, wrinkled, the whole polished mask of the perfect socialite cracked away to show the thief beneath. She punched in another sequence. 21, the year they put me away. Beep. Error. The red light blinked at her with something almost like contempt. System locked. Wait 5 minutes. She let out a low animal sound of frustration and pressed her forehead against the cold steel of the safe door. It's not going to open, Lacey, I said. My voice was barely above a whisper, but in that silent room it landed like a shot. Lacey screamed a sharp cut-off shriek and spun around. She dropped the flashlight. It skittered across the floor, its beam cartwheeling until it came to rest, pointing at my polished black shoes. I stood in the doorway wrapped in shadow, still, unblinking. Who's there? She gasped, pressing herself back against the wall. I stepped forward into the edge of the light. The mirrors did the rest suddenly. A dozen versions of me surrounded her, every reflection, wearing the same cold, unhurried judgment. It's the ghost, I said. Clifford. She breathed, one hand pressed to her chest. You scared me half to death. What are you doing creeping around in the dark? I walked into the room at my own pace. I picked up the flashlight and turned it directly on her face. She recoiled, squinting, raising a hand against the glare. I live here, I said, quiet and lethal. Remember, I could ask you the same thing. It's 3 a.m, and you're trying to crack a safe that isn't yours. I was looking for my earrings, she said quickly, her eyes skittering around the room. I think I left them in here when I was working out. I thought maybe I'd put them in the safe for safekeeping. I let out a laugh, dry, hollow, nothing warm in it. You don't know the code, Lacey, I said. You never did. And even if you had, there's nothing in there that you're after. No cash. I moved the liquid assets years ago. I took another step. She was pinned between me and the rowing machine, where my leather armchair used to sit. So tell me the truth, I said, tilting the beam so shadow carved deep lines across her face. What were you actually looking for? I leaned in close enough to catch the stale champagne on her breath. Were you after the deed to the house? I asked. Or something else entirely? I let the silence stretch until I could see her beginning to shake. Were you looking for proof of your affair, the one from 2 years ago? I whispered. Her eyes went wide. The color left her face all at once, leaving her gray and washed out in the hard light. What are you talking about? She stammered, but the conviction wasn't there. The personal trainer, I said. The one with the tattoo on his neck. The one you were seeing while Beckett was at the office. The one who was actually driving the motorcycle the night of your accident. Lacey shook her head in hard, rapid jerks. You're lying. Her voice came out as a shriek, but it was panic, not outrage. You're out of your mind. I reached into my pocket and produced the earpiece. I held it up between us. I hear everything, Lacey, I said. I hear the demands for money. I hear the threats to leave. And tonight, I see the thief working in the dark. I clicked off the flashlight, dropping the room back into total darkness. Run along to bed, my dear, I said from somewhere in the black. Lock your door not to keep me out, but because once Beckett learns what I know, he may be the one you need to worry about. I heard a sob tear free from her throat, then the slap of bare feet against the floor as she bolted past me out of the room and up the stairs, running as though the devil himself had her by the heels. I stood alone in the dark study. I crossed to the safe. I entered the code 730, the number of days I had spent in prison. The safe beeped green and swung open. I reached inside and drew out a single manila envelope. Thick, heavy. I shut the safe. Sleep tight, Lacey, I whispered. Tomorrow, the nightmare starts in earnest. The following morning, I took a cab to the south side of the city. I hadn't asked Warren to drive me because there are some places a gleaming black Rolls-Royce simply does not belong. The neighborhood was a graveyard of industry. Empty factories with shattered windows stood like carcasses against a gray sky. The streets were rutted with potholes and heaped with trash that nobody had come to collect. This was where my son had deposited his own family while he lived in every luxury money could buy. I pulled my hat down low and stepped into a diner called the Iron Ladle. Inside, the air was thick with stale grease and scorched coffee. The linoleum floor was cracked and the vinyl booth seats were held together with strips of duct tape. I settled into the back corner where the shadows were heaviest. I didn't need the menu. I just watched the woman working behind the counter. Nadine looked a full decade older than the last time I'd laid eyes on her. Her strawberry blonde hair, once bright, was scraped back into a hasty bun. Her uniform was stained and hung loose on her thin frame. She moved with the frantic, brittle energy of someone terrified of putting a foot wrong. A truck driver grabbed her wrist and said something that made her flinch. She pulled free and stretched a polite smile across her face, one that never came close to her eyes. My heart cracked open. This was the woman who had made my son into something worth being proud of. The woman who had given me a grandson, and she was being treated like she was nothing. I waited until the lunch crowd thinned out. When she finally made her way to my booth with a coffee pot, she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were on her notepad. "What can I get for you, hun?" she asked, her voice worn ragged with exhaustion. "Hello, Nadine," I said. She went completely still. The pot shook in her hand, sending a few drops of hot coffee spattering across the table. She raised her eyes to mine slowly, and what I found in them was pure, unguarded terror. She took a step back, gripping the pot like something she might need to defend herself with. "Clifford," she whispered. "Oh God, please. I don't have any money." She thought I'd come to harm her. She believed the story Beckett had sold to everyone, that I was exactly the monster they'd painted me as. "Sit down, Nadine," I said quietly, gesturing to the seat across from me. "Please, I'm not here to hurt you." She glanced toward her manager, checking, then slid into the booth and perched right on the edge, ready to bolt at any moment. "They said you were in prison," she said, her hands trembling on the table. "They said you'd never get out." "I was released yesterday," I told her, "and the first thing I wanted was to see you. And the boy, how is Cody?" The moment I said her son's name, something shifted in her face. Her fear gave way to something fiercer. She leaned forward, every inch the protective mother. "Stay away from him," she said sharply. Beckett had made himself very clear. If I try to reach the family, or if I let you anywhere near Cody, he cuts off the alimony. He takes full custody. He told me you're dangerous, Clifford. He told me what you did to Lacey. I reached across the table and covered her hands with mine. She tried to pull back, but I held on gently but without letting go. "I never touched Lacey," I said, looking straight into her eyes. "Not once. And I know you didn't cheat on Beckett either." Nadine's eyes filled. The resistance drained right out of her, and she slumped back against the booth. "It doesn't matter what's true," she said, blotting her eyes with a coarse paper napkin. "It only matters what they can prove. Lacey is smart, Clifford. Evil, but smart. She hired that actor. She set up the hotel room. She called me there, said it was a catering emergency for Beckett's company. The moment I walked in, that man grabbed me and the photographer burst out of the closet. She turned to stare out at the bleak street beyond the window. Beckett didn't even ask for an explanation. She went on, her voice gone hard and bitter. He had the divorce papers ready. The next morning he threw us out with nothing. He said Cody probably wasn't even his. He killed her credit cards. He blocked her number. We lived in a shelter for 3 months, Clifford. A shelter while he was buying Lacey a Porsche. I felt the fury rise in my chest, hot and familiar, but I pressed it back down. Rage is worthless until it has somewhere to go. I know, Nadine, I said. I know all of it. I know about the fabricated miscarriage. I know about the embezzlement. And I know that Cody is the only true heir to the Drummond name. Nadine looked at me with hollow eyes. So what? She said. You're just an old man with a criminal record, and I'm a waitress in a 1-bedroom apartment with rats in the walls. We can't fight them, Clifford. They have lawyers. They have money. If we try anything, they will grind us into the pavement. Please just go. Leave us alone before Beckett finds out you were here. She started to slide out of the booth. I'm not asking you to fight Nadine, I said. She stopped moving. I reached into my jacket pocket. What I drew out wasn't a weapon. It was the file, the Nemesis file. I laid it flat on the sticky tabletop and slid it across to her. Open it, I said. Nadine hesitated, then lifted the cover. She looked at the documents inside. She saw the loan agreement. She saw the default clauses. She saw the name of the holding company, Nemesis Corp. I don't understand, she said, glancing up at me. What is all this? This, I said, is the end of Beckett Drummond. I leaned in, dropping my voice. I am Nemesis Nadine. I hold the debt. I hold the mortgage on the mansion. I hold the company's operating capital. I own them. Her eyes went wide as it landed. You lent him the money, she stammered. I gave him the shovel, I corrected. He dug the hole himself, but I need one thing to finish the burial. I need a witness. I tapped the documents in her hand. I can take his money, I can take his house, but I need your help to take his freedom. I need you to testify about the setup. I need you to stand before a judge and describe exactly how Lacey engineered the divorce. I have the medical records that prove the miscarriage was a fabrication. Your testimony combined with that evidence establishes a pattern of fraud. We can put them exactly where they belong. Nadine looked down at her own hands. They were red and cracked from hours of scrubbing tables. I'm scared, Clifford, she whispered. Beckett threatened me. He said he'd make sure I never worked in this town again. I reached into my pocket one more time. This time I came out with a check written that morning from the Nemesis operating account. $50,000. I set it on top of the file and pushed it toward her. This is yours, I said. A consulting fee. Use it to get a proper apartment. Get Cody some new clothes. Walk out of this job today. Nadine stared at the check. Her mouth opened. Clifford, she breathed. I can't take this. It isn't a gift, I said firmly. It's an advance. When we win, you'll be running the Drummond Foundation. You will never pour another cup of coffee for anyone again. But you have to find your courage. Not for me, for Cody. Do you want him growing up in this neighborhood, or do you want him growing up in the house his grandfather built? Nadine looked at the check, then at the file, then at me. I watched something shift behind her eyes. The fear didn't leave, but something else pushed up alongside it. Hope, and the fierce iron will of a mother who wants justice. She drew a slow breath. She picked up the check and held it in both hands. He told me I was worthless, she said, her voice unsteady but climbing. He told me I was nothing without him. He was wrong, I said. Nadine nodded. She got to her feet. She pulled off her apron and dropped it on the table. It landed with a soft, final thud. I get off at 2, she said. Where do we start? I smiled. We start by finding you a lawyer, I said. And then we light the match. I watched her walk back behind the counter and tell her manager she was done. For the first time in 2 years, something genuinely warm moved through my chest. I had my ally. I had my family back. And Beckett and Lacey were sitting in their glass castle, completely blind to the fact that the stones were already in the air. The headquarters of Drummond Logistics climbed above the city skyline like a monument built from steel and ambition. I stood on the sidewalk across the street and looked up at the 42nd floor. That used to be my office. What you are about to witness is the moment when everything Clifford had quietly set in motion begins to land, and the cost of what was done to him becomes impossible to ignore. Before we get there, I want to ask you something. If the people closest to you had been working against you in silence, would you confront them the moment you knew? Or would you wait, gather every last piece of proof, and let the truth speak for itself. That was where I had put my signature on the papers for my first fleet of trucks. And that was where my son now sat preparing to hand the last piece of my life's work to a consortium of foreign investors who had no interest in anything beyond stripping the assets and clearing out the American workforce. I straightened my tie in the reflection of the glass doors. I wasn't wearing the loose suit from the day before. I had on a navy pinstripe suit tailored to a perfect fit. It was old, but it carried authority. I walked toward the revolving doors, my heart hammering, not from fear, but with the steady rhythm of a war drum. The lobby smelled exactly as I remembered it, lemon polish and conditioned air. The receptionist was someone I didn't recognize. Young, and she looked at me with a muddled mixture of uncertainty and dawning recognition. Her hand moved toward the phone, probably to alert Beckett, but I raised a hand and kept walking without slowing. I headed straight for the security turnstiles. Standing there was Otto. Head of security, a big man with shoulders like a linebacker and a genuine decency underneath all that bulk. I had paid for his daughter's knee surgery 10 years ago. When he saw me, something in his face went soft. He glanced at the monitor where a memo bearing my photograph was almost certainly posted under the heading, "Do not admit." Otto stepped into my path. To anyone watching on the cameras, he looked like he was doing exactly his job. He leaned in close, his hand resting on his belt. "Mr. Drummond," he rumbled, keeping his voice low. "They told me to call the police if you came in, said you were dangerous." I held his gaze. "Do I look dangerous to you, Otto?" I asked. A small sad smile crossed his face. "You look like the boss to me," he murmured. He reached into his pocket, produced a key card, and swiped it across the sensor. The gate beeped green and swung open. "Give them hell, sir," Otto said, stepping aside. I nodded my thanks and made my way to the private elevator. The doors closed and sealed me in silence as the floor numbers climbed toward 42. I felt the weight of the past 2 years beginning to lift floor by floor. I was rising, I was returning. The elevator chimed. The doors parted directly into the executive lobby. The boardroom lay straight ahead, its double-glass doors frosted over. Through the haze, I could make out the shapes of the people gathered inside. I could hear Beckett's voice pitched high and running fast. The voice of a man trying to sell a horse that was already going under. I walked up to those doors without breaking stride. I did not knock. I pushed them open with both hands and stepped into the room. Silence dropped over the table like a curtain. 12 people sat around the wide oval surface. 6 were the foreign investors' men in expensive suits, their expressions giving away nothing. 4 were the remaining board members, loyalists Beckett had placed himself. And at the head of the table stood Beckett, one hand still raised toward a projection screen showing a liquidation profit forecast. He went completely still. He looked at me the way you look at something you were certain you'd buried. "Security!" he shouted, his voice splintering. "How did you get in here? Otto, get up here." I walked to the far end of the table and set my briefcase down on the mahogany with a deliberate thud. "Otto is occupied," I said, letting my voice fill the room. "And this meeting is unlawful." Beckett turned a deep mottled red. "Get out!" he shouted. "You have no authority in this room. You're a convicted felon. You were removed from the board. You have 0 shares, 0 voting rights. You are nobody." The lead investor, gray-haired, cold-eyed, not a man who enjoyed surprises, looked from Beckett to me. He did not look entertained. "Mr. Drummond," he said, directing the name at Beckett, "is this going to be a problem? We were assured the family situation was settled." "It is settled," Beckett said, mopping sweat from his forehead. "My father is suffering from delusions. He has no legal standing. We can proceed with the vote. I hold 51% of the voting stocks. I have authorized the sale." He turned to the board members. "Vote," he ordered. "Raise your hands. Approve the division sale." I reached into my briefcase. "Before anyone raises a hand," I said loud enough to stop the room cold, "you might want to check your arithmetic, Beckett." I drew out a stack of papers, not crisp, high-gloss documents from some white shoe law firm. These were creased. Some had coffee rings on them. A few were handwritten. "You're right that I hold no shares," I went on. "You stripped every one of them from me, but you overlooked the employee stock ownership plan." Beckett let out a short, nervous laugh. "The ESOP," he scoffed. "We're talking about tiny fractions. Truck drivers, mechanics, administrative staff. They carry no weight. They're irrelevant." I spread the papers across the table, fanning them out like a hand of cards. "You're wrong, son. I said. They are the company. And for the last 24 hours while you were orchestrating your gala and buying your wife jewelry, I was out visiting them. The break rooms, the loading docks, the mechanic shops. I lifted one page from the spread. This is a proxy form signed by Dave Miller, head mechanic 30 years with this company. This one comes from Mrs. Higgins, your former executive assistant, the one you let go last month. And this one is from the entire union chapter of the Northeast Division. I looked at the investors. These people own shares, small ones, yes, but in aggregate they represent 15% of the total voting stock, and every one of them has signed those voting rights over to me for this meeting. The color drained from Beckett's face as the arithmetic caught up with him. He'd sold off 40% to service his debts. A supermajority was required to authorize a sale of this scale. My 15% was a wall he couldn't climb. I hold the proxy for 15% of this company, I declared, and on behalf of the men and women who actually built it, I vote no. The room held its breath. The lead investor closed his folder. He rose from his chair. Mr. Drummond, he said to Beckett, it appears you do not hold the authorization you represented to us. We don't conduct business with people who misrepresent the facts. He signaled to his team. They stood as one and filed out of the room. Not one of them glanced at Beckett as they passed. The door clicked shut. Beckett stood shaking at the head of the table. His deal was dead. His liquidity had vanished. The money had walked out the door. He looked at me with something wild and unhinged behind his eyes. He snatched a heavy crystal water glass from the table. "You old bastard!" he screamed. He flung it across the room. It missed my head by inches and exploded against the wall behind me, scattering into 1,000 pieces. Water ran down the expensive wallpaper in slow streaks. "You ruined it," Beckett shrieked. "That was 12 million. That was our lifeline. Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed us. You want us to starve. Is that it? You want your own family on the street. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I looked at the shattered glass, then back at him. "I don't want you to starve, Beckett," I said, picking up my briefcase with perfect calm. "I want you to work. There's a difference." I turned my back and walked toward the door. "And Beckett," I added, pausing with my hand on the handle, "fix the wall. It comes out of your salary." I walked out and left him raging in the wreckage of his own greed. The boardroom battle was finished, but the war for my family's soul was nowhere near its end. I had stopped the bleeding. Now it was time for surgery. And surgery is never without pain. Dr. Aldous Fenwick's private medical practice occupied a glass building that felt more like a 5-star hotel than any clinic had a right to. The waiting room was hung with abstract art and carried the scent of lavender and quiet money. The silence in there cost roughly $500 an hour. I walked past the receptionist, a young woman too absorbed in her phone to notice 2 men in suits moving with purpose toward the private offices. Warren tried to catch my eye, looking uneasy, but I kept my focus fixed on the mahogany door at the corridor's end. The nameplate read, "Dr. Aldous Fenwick, Chief of Obstetrics. To the world, a respected specialist. To me, the man who had sold my freedom for a check." I did not knock. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. Dr. Fenwick was behind a desk nearly as imposing as the one I used to own. He was a handsome man, in his 50s, deeply tanned with silver hair that was perfectly coiffed. He was on the phone laughing at something. When he saw us, the laughter died in his throat. He lowered the phone slowly and ended the call. "Who let you in here?" he asked, his voice smooth but bitten through with irritation. "I'm with a patient." I swept my eyes around the empty room. "I don't see a patient, doctor," I said, turning the lock behind me with a quiet click. "I see a businessman, and I'm here to make a deal." Fenwick got to his feet. He knew who I was. I watched the recognition flare in his eyes, and right behind it a flash of panic that he buried fast. He smoothed the front of his white coat. "Mr. Drummond," he said, his tone sliding into condescension, "I heard about your release. I expect this intrusion reflects some lingering disorientation from your time away. Leave now, and I won't involve the police. Stay, and I'll have you arrested for harassment again." I walked to the leather chair across from his desk and settled into it. I crossed my legs and picked an imaginary thread from my trousers. "Call them," I said. Fenwick's hand hovered over the intercom. "Excuse me," he said. "Call the police," I repeated. I'd welcome it. I'd particularly enjoy a conversation with the fraud division. I suspect they'd find your offshore accounts rather interesting, the one in the Cayman Islands specifically that received $50,000 2 years ago. On the precise day you signed the affidavit claiming my daughter-in-law miscarried as the result of blunt force trauma. Fenwick went still, his finger pulled back from the button. He lowered himself into his chair, slowly, eyes narrowing. I have no idea what you're referring to, he said. My finances are private, and my medical conclusions are grounded in science, not bribery. I nodded to Warren. My lawyer stepped forward, opened his briefcase, and placed a single sheet of paper on the desk with deliberate care. It was a wire transfer record showing a payment from a shell company registered to Lacey Renault directly into an account called Asclepius Holdings. That's your holding company, isn't it? Warren said. We traced the registration. It leads straight back to this address. Fenwick looked at the document. A bead of sweat surfaced near his hairline. He wiped it away with a quick hand. This proves nothing, he snapped. Patients pay for discretion. That was a consulting fee. Consulting on what? I asked, leaning forward. How to frame an innocent man, how to fabricate a pregnancy loss. Fenwick's hand came down hard on the desk. Get out, he shouted, his composure cracking. You have nothing. That affidavit was accurate. She came in bleeding. She had bruising consistent with a fall. I treated her. I documented what I saw. You can't intimidate me, Drummond. I have allies on the medical board. I have lawyers who will take you apart. I said nothing. I let his fury fill the room and exhaust itself. When the last of it had burned out, I reached into my pocket and produced a second piece of paper, a photograph Granny pulled from a traffic camera, dated May 14th, 2 years ago, 2 hours before Lacey supposedly fell down the staircase at my house. The image showed a motorcycle on its side on a slick highway. A man stood over it assessing the damage. Seated on the curb nearby, clutching her midsection, was a woman with her helmet off. It was Lacey. I slid the photograph across the desk. This was taken 5 miles from the city center, I said. Single vehicle accident. The police report says the driver lost control on a wet patch of road. The passenger declined treatment at the scene. She said she'd see her own doctor. I looked at him steadily. She came to you, didn't she? Fenwick stared at the photograph. The color left his face. She came to you injured, I went on, my voice giving him nowhere to hide. She was bleeding. She was in pain. But not because she fell down my staircase. Because she'd been riding on the back of a motorcycle with her lover. And she knew that if Beckett found out she'd been reckless, that she'd been with another man, she'd lose everything. The prenuptial agreement would have left her with nothing. Fenwick didn't speak. He was breathing in tight, shallow pulls, his eyes jumping between the photograph and the door. So she made a plan, I said. She called you. She paid you. She told you to document it as a domestic accident. Then she went home, waited for the right argument, and threw herself down a few carpeted steps to match the bruising she already had. It was a perfect crime. I leaned in, dropping my voice to barely above a whisper. Except, there was no baby. Was there? Fenwick looked up. His eyes had gone wide. There was no baby, I said. Was there? Fenwick wet his lips. He glanced at Warren, who stood with a pen poised over a legal pad. Then his gaze came back to me. He read the certainty in my face. He saw that I wasn't testing him. He saw the end of everything he'd spent his career building. If I tell you, he whispered, his voice barely holding together, if I give you the truth, will you keep me out of it? I can't go to prison, Clifford. I have a family. I have a reputation. I don't care about your reputation, I said without warmth. But I do care about mine. Help me clear my name and I'll ask the district attorney to consider leniency. I'll tell them you came forward willingly. That's the best offer you'll see. Turn it down, and I walk out of here and hand this photograph and that bank record to every reporter in the city. You'll be finished before morning. Fenwick seemed to cave from the inside out. He looked small. He set his glasses on the desk and pressed his fingers into his eyes. She was never pregnant, he said, barely audible. Warren's pen started moving fast. Say it again, I said. Clearly. Fenwick raised his eyes, red-rimmed now. She was never pregnant with Beckett's child, he said. She had an ovarian cyst. It had been causing her pain for months. She refused treatment because she was trying to conceive to lock down the marriage, but she couldn't manage it. And the accident, I pressed. The accident ruptured the cyst, he confessed. That was the bleeding. That was the pain. She came to me terrified. She told me she'd been with a friend. She said Beckett would destroy her if he found out. She begged me. She said if I wrote it up as a miscarriage, she could blame the whole thing on the fall. It would make all her problems disappear. She offered me $50 and $. He paused. I had gambling debts. I took the money. A wave of nausea moved through me. 2 years of my life. 2 years in a cage. All of it built on a ruptured cyst and a paid-off doctor. And the stairs? I asked. She staged that herself, he said, shaking his head. She wanted you gone. She said you were asking too many questions about the finances. Said you were in the way, knocking you out and getting rid of you 2 birds with 1 stone. I settled back in the chair. The room felt strange. The truth was worse than I'd prepared myself for. This wasn't just greed. This was cold, deliberate malice. Write it down, I said. What? Fenwick asked. A full confession? I said, pointing to the notepad on his desk. Everything, the cyst, the accident, the payment, the false diagnosis, all of it, and sign it. He hesitated for no more than a second, then picked up his pen. He wrote for 10 minutes. The only sounds in that room were the drag of the pen across paper and his uneven breathing. When he was done, he pushed the pad across the desk. I read every word. It was damning. It was exactly what I needed. I rose from the chair. I took the notepad and passed it to Warren. We need this notarized, I told him, and a copy goes to the district attorney today. I looked down at Fenwick. He was slumped with his head in his hands. You are a disgrace to your profession, I said. I know, he whispered. I walked to the door and turned the lock. Don't leave town, doctor, I said. The police will be coming, but since you've chosen to cooperate, you may yet hold on to a few years. That's more than you deserve. I walked out of the office and down the corridor. Warren kept pace beside me, clutching the notepad as if it were something sacred. We got him, Warren said, his voice full of disbelief. We actually got him. We got the pawn, I said, keeping my eyes ahead. Now we go for the queen. I stepped out of the building and into open air. It tasted cleaner than it had in years. The noise of the city sounded almost like music. I had the weapon I'd come for. The noose was drawing tight around Lacey's neck, and tomorrow I would kick the chair out from under her. The grand ballroom of the City Arts Center was a spectacle of pure excess. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling, like frozen fireworks pouring a warm golden light down over the assembled elite of the city. 500 guests filled the hall that night. Men in tuxedos who held the city's financial strings, women in gowns that would have swallowed a teacher's yearly pay. They sipped vintage champagne and grazed on caviar, blissfully unaware that they had gathered inside an abattoir, and the animal being walked to slaughter was my own flesh and blood. I held my position in the shadow of the velvet curtains, stage right. To the crowd, I was nothing invisible, irrelevant, but I had an unobstructed line of sight straight to the podium. Beckett stood up there, drinking in the applause. He looked every inch the polished CEO, hair sculpted to perfection, smile wide, bright, and utterly hollow. Lacey occupied a seat in the front row, a necklace resting at her throat. Another piece I recognized from my late wife's jewelry collection. She was applauding, eyes lifted toward him, with an expression of devotion I knew dissolved the instant the cameras lost interest. Beckett leaned into the microphone, his voice rolling through the hall smooth and full of command. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, opening his arms as though embracing the room. Tonight is about far more than raising money for the arts. It is about legacy. My father, Clifford Drummond, laid a remarkable foundation, but the future belongs to innovation. The future belongs to those courageous enough to accept risk, and I am proud to announce that Drummond Logistics is entering a bold new era of prosperity. We are expanding. We are growing, and we are stronger than we have ever been. I glanced at my watch. 8 o'clock precisely. The timing was everything. At that exact moment, on every newswire in the city and around the world, the automated press release from Nemesis Corporation went live. At the same instant, the foreclosure notice was filed electronically with the county clerk. And most critically, a notification was pushed directly to the financial app sitting in every pocket and purse in the room. It began as a ripple. A phone chimed somewhere near the back, then another. A pocket buzzed against someone's leg. A purse trembled against a chair. Within 10 seconds, the well-mannered murmur of 500 attentive guests had been replaced by a peculiar digital hum, the collective sound of bad news arriving all at once. Beckett faltered. He sensed the change in the room before he understood it. He watched the head of the Commerce Bank drop his gaze to his phone, brow furrowing. He saw the mayor lean toward his wife, lips moving, one finger pointed toward the stage. "We are," Beckett stammered, grasping for the thread. "We are committed to excellence." but the room had already moved on. Screens glowed everywhere, washing upturned faces in cold blue light. The headline was blunt and merciless. Drummond Logistics defaults. Nemesis Corp. Seizes control. Assets frozen. Bankruptcy imminent. The whispering swelled. It rose in pitch and volume like the drone of a disturbed hive. I watched a woman in the second row hold her phone out toward Lacey. Lacey looked at the screen. Her jaw went slack. She lurched to her feet, sending her chair toppling behind her. She locked eyes with Beckett, wide, frantic, terrified, and shook her head in sharp, desperate jerks. Beckett looked bewildered. A nervous laugh escaped him, high and thin, reverberating painfully through the microphone. Is there a problem?" he asked. I stepped out from behind the curtains. I did not rush. I walked. Each footstep landed heavy and deliberate on the wooden stage boards. I came up directly behind Beckett. He had no idea I was there until the crowd gasped. He spun around and recoiled as though the sight of me had scorched him. "Dad!" he breathed. "What are you doing here? Get off the stage." I reached over and lifted the microphone from his grip. He was too stunned to hold on. I took the stand in both hands and faced the audience. I saw the shock. I saw the judgment. And I saw the moment it registered that the king was gone and the old lion had come back. "Good evening," I said. My voice was flat, cold, and perfectly controlled. "I apologize for the disruption. My son was just sharing his vision for the future of Drummond Logistics, but he appears to have omitted a few critical facts about the present." I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the deed. The real deed. The one transferred to Nemesis Corporation 5 minutes prior. "You all just received a notification on your phones," I went on. "It tells you that Drummond Logistics has defaulted on a significant loan. It tells you that a company called Nemesis Corporation has exercised its contractual right to seize all assets, the corporate headquarters, the fleet, the executive voting rights." I let the silence hold for a moment. Every word of that is true, but there is one detail the news report failed to include. It did not name the owner of Nemesis Corporation. I turned and looked directly at Beckett. He was trembling. His face had gone the color of ash. The full picture was assembling itself behind his eyes. The loan, the trap, the man standing inches away. "I own it," I said, turning back to the crowd. The collective intake of breath was audible. "I am Nemesis," I announced, my voice climbing. "I am the creditor. I am the bank. And as of 8:01 this evening, I am the sole owner of Drummond Logistics." Beckett seized my arm. "You cannot do this," he hissed. "That loan that was private equity, you deceived me." I pulled free of his grip. "I did not deceive you, son. I gave you a test. You failed it. You gambled the company on a fiction. You mortgaged my legacy to bankroll your wife's appetite. The account is now settled." I looked down at Lacey in the front row. She had gone rigid. She looked ready to bolt, but there was no exit that served her. "And there is one additional matter," I said back into the microphone. "The collateral securing the loan included all personal assets pledged by the guarantor. That means the vehicles, that means the accounts, and that means the house." I pointed at Beckett. "This gala is finished. The company is under new management, and my son no longer has a roof over his head." The room went absolutely still. The silence of a blade suspended at the top of its arc. Then Beckett broke. The humiliation was more weight than he could carry, the loss of his standing, his wealth, his carefully constructed identity destroyed in front of the very people he had spent years trying to impress. Something inside him gave way. He let out a raw animal howl of rage. "You stole it!" he shrieked. "You thief, I will kill you!" He threw himself at me. Fingers curled like claws, hands reaching for my throat. He wanted to choke the life out of me in front of every witness in the room. I did not move. I did not flinch. I held my ground, ready to absorb whatever he brought, but it wasn't necessary. From the wings, a large figure appeared. It was Otto, head of security. He covered the distance faster than a man of his build had any right to. He caught Beckett mid-lunge, driving him into the floor with a collision that shook the stage. "Get off me!" Beckett shrieked, writhing against the boards like a cornered animal. "That is my company! He is the criminal! Arrest him!" Otto wrenched Beckett's arms behind his back and looked up at me, waiting. "Remove him, Otto," I said quietly, my voice still in the microphone. "And take his wife as well. They are trespassing." 2 additional guards materialized and caught Lacey mid-flight toward the side exit. She screamed, kicking and clawing as they hauled her toward the doors. Beckett was dragged upright. His tuxedo was in tatters. His hair had come apart. He looked at me with eyes that held equal parts tears and hatred. "I am your son," he choked out. "How could you do this to me?" I studied him, the boy I had raised, the man he had chosen to become, the man who had put his own father in a cage. "You stopped being my son the day you locked me away," I said. "Get him out of my sight." Otto pulled him toward the exit. Beckett's screams rang through the ballroom until the heavy double doors swung shut and cut off the sound entirely. I stood alone on the stage, 500 pairs of eyes on me. Terrified, awestruck. They had just watched a massacre and a coronation fold into a single moment. I straightened my tie. I returned to the microphone. "Please enjoy the dessert," I said. "I'm told the lemon souffle is outstanding." I set the microphone back on the stand and walked off the stage without a backward glance. I had stripped him of his armor. I had taken his sword. He stood exposed with nothing. But I was not finished. He had lost his money. His freedom was still his. I intended to correct that. The backstage corridor was a narrow concrete passage of exposed wiring and the smell of old dust and stale adrenaline, the unglamorous machinery hidden behind the velvet curtain. It was fitting that this cramped, graceless place was where my family finally came apart. Out in the ballroom, the roar had softened to a low, baffled rumble. Back here, the sounds were sharp and raw. Otto and the other guards had hauled Beckett into a holding area near the loading dock. He was a wrecked tuxedo jacket, ripped at the shoulder face, shining with sweat and tears. The fight had drained out of him. He was hyperventilating now, eyes skittering around the room, like a cornered animal searching for any way out. Lacey was there too, hemmed in by 2 security officers who were blocking her path to the exit with firm professional courtesy. I came through the heavy metal door and heard it click shut behind me, swallowing most of the noise still leaking from the gala. But I hadn't come alone. The press had located the side entrance. A dozen reporters, cameras, microphones, lenses were pressing against the security line, hungry for whatever wreckage remained from the bomb I had set off on that stage. I gave Otto a nod to let them through. The truth deserved witnesses. Beckett spotted me and lurched upright, stumbling across the floor toward Lacey. He reached for her with both hands, desperate for an ally, desperate for the woman he had hollowed himself out trying to please. "Lacey, tell them," he begged, his voice high and unraveling. "Tell them about the trust. Tell them about the baby's rights. He can't take everything. We still have your accounts. We still have the offshore money." Lacey knocked his hand aside. The crack of it rang off the concrete walls like a shot. She stepped back and looked at him, not with fear, not with sympathy, but with undisguised contempt and revulsion. Every layer of the performance had dissolved. No more devoted, supportive wife. What remained was a rat who had just understood that the ship was going down, and the captain with it. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice razor-edged. "You are pathetic. Look at yourself, crying like a child." "Lacey," Beckett gasped, one hand pressed to his chest. "What are you saying? We're in this together. We need to call a lawyer. There is no we." Lacey's voice tore open the room. "You're broke, Beckett. You heard him. You don't have a home. Did you think I signed up for this? Did you think I married you for your personality? You are a weak, spineless little man who needed his father to run his life for him. And now you don't even have his money." She turned to the guards and leveled a manicured finger at the door. "I am leaving," she announced. "I'm filing for divorce in the morning, and you can tell your father I'm taking half of whatever scraps remain. I want spousal support. I want child support. I will drain you dry for the next 18 years. She wheeled to go, her red dress sweeping around her like a spreading pool of blood. "You are not going anywhere, Lacey." My voice stopped her as cleanly as a wall. I stepped forward into the cone of light from the overhead rig. The reporters lifted their camera shutters, firing in rapid succession. Lacey spun back around, eyes narrowed to slits. "Get out of my way, old man," she hissed. "You got your company, congratulations. Now stand aside, I have a son to raise." I reached into my inner jacket pocket. This was the moment, the final nail driven home. "You do not have a son with Beckett." I said, my tone perfectly level. The silence that settled over the room had real weight. Beckett looked up from the floor, face streaked in raw confusion and panic, fighting each other behind his eyes. "What?" he whispered. "What did you just say?" I crossed the floor toward him. The anger was gone from my face. What had replaced it was something quieter and far more devastating: pity. I held up a document. It was the paternity test I had commissioned from the DNA sample I'd pulled out of the rubbish bin during my first visit to the mansion, a used diaper discarded without a second thought. I placed the paper in Beckett's hands. "Read it," I said. Beckett took it. His hands were trembling so violently he could barely keep the page still. He worked through the numbers, the clinical language, and then reached the conclusion printed at the bottom of the page. Probability of paternity 0%. His mouth fell open. No sound came out. He looked at Lacey. "Lacey," he choked. "What is this?" Lacey's face drained of all color. She lunged for the paper, but Otto stepped squarely into her path. "It's a forgery!" she shrieked, turning to face the cameras. "He fabricated it. He's trying to frame me." I produced the second document, the sworn statement from Dr. Fenwick. I held it up so the press could see it clearly. "And this," I said, projecting toward the microphones, "is a sworn affidavit from Dr. Aldous Fenwick. It sets out in detail how Ms. Renault paid him $50,000 to fake a miscarriage 2 years ago. There was no baby then, and the child she carries now." I turned my gaze directly onto Lacey, who had backed herself flat against the wall, trembling. "I did my homework, Lacey," I continued. "I pulled the visitor logs from the gym you use. I traced the credit card charges on the hotel rooms. And then I ran a second DNA comparison. I drew out a photograph. It showed the personal trainer, the man with the tattoo on his neck. 'Meet the real father,' I said, and let the photo drop at Beckett's feet. Beckett stared at it. He stared at the paternity test. Then he raised his eyes to his wife, the woman he had sent his own father to prison to shield, the woman he had stolen millions to satisfy, the woman who was staring back at him, now not with love, but with the wide calculating eyes of a swindler whose cover has just been blown. "Is it true?" Beckett whispered. His voice had the sound of something broken glass being slowly ground to powder. Lacey said nothing. She didn't need to. The silence answered for her. And then Beckett screamed. Not a scream of fury. It was a scream of pure anguish, the sound of a man discovering that everything he believed in was an illusion. He dropped to his knees on the bare concrete floor. He seized his own hair, rocking forward and back. "I put him in jail!" Beckett wailed, driving his fist into the ground until the skin split and his knuckles bled. "I put my own father in jail for you. I destroyed everything for you, and it was all a lie." He looked up at me, eyes red and blown wide open with a horror that I knew would never fully leave him. "Dad," he sobbed. "Dad, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. She told me you hurt her. She told me the baby was mine." I stood over him. He was a demolished man, nothing left but the shell. "Ignorance is not a defense, Beckett," I said, and kept my voice cold. "You chose to believe a lie because the truth required too much of you. You chose her over your own blood." Beckett crawled toward Lacey, seizing the hem of her red dress. "You monster!" he screamed, hurling the words at her. "You destroyed us!" Lacey kicked him away. She glanced at the cameras, understood in that instant that her life as a socialite was finished, and finally collapsed. She slid down the wall and buried her face in her hands, weeping not for what she had done to others, but for what she had lost herself. I faced the press. "You have your story," I said. "The fraud, the adultery, the theft. Print every word of it." I looked at Otto. "Call the police," I said. "We have a confession to file, and I believe there are outstanding warrants for both of them by now." I turned and moved toward the exit. Behind me, Beckett's weeping tangled with the bark of reporters and the strobe of camera flashes. It was a symphony of ruin. I stepped out into the cool night air. Inside, the gala was still technically in progress, but the party had long since ended. The house of cards had come down. I was the only one still standing. The night air outside the City Arts Center was no longer cool and still. It had become a wall of sirens and shouting. Red and blue lights from the police cruisers strobed across wet pavement, turning everything into a fractured, lurching nightmare. I took up a position near the valet stand and watched it all play out. The gala guests had poured out onto the grand staircase, their expensive gowns and tuxedos pressed together against the wind phones, held high to document the fall of the House of Drummond. They had arrived expecting a coronation. They were staying for an execution. Otto had performed his role without a single misstep. The police had come out in numbers, and not the local beat officers who might develop a convenient blind spot in exchange for a charitable donation. These were detectives from the Financial Crimes Division and officers attached to the state prosecutor's office. They moved with a focused, unhurried efficiency that told me they had gone through every file Warren and I had sent over. They knew exactly who they were there for. Lacey was the first one out through the side exit. She was bracketed by two female officers, each holding one of her arms. That red dress, which had looked so commanding beneath the stage lights, now read like a costume from a cut-rate production. Her hair was unraveling mascara, dragged in dark streaks across both cheeks. She was not going to make this easy. She was screaming, driving her heels into the concrete, twisting against the officer's grip with everything she had. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her voice stripped raw. "Do you know who I am? I am a Drummond. My husband owns this city. Release me right now, or I will sue you into the ground." One of the detectives, tall, hollow-eyed, thoroughly unimpressed, stepped into her path. He unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal caught the strobing lights as he raised them. "Lacey Renaud," he said, his voice slicing clean through her hysteria. "You are under arrest for grand larceny, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit extortion. You have the right to remain silent." He turned her around. The cuffs ratcheted shut with a sound that was short and absolute. Lacey went rigid. The bite of cold steel at her wrists seemed to knock the screaming right out of her. She looked up and found me standing 10 feet away. Her eyes were wide hatred and disbelief, sharing equal space behind them. Her mouth opened to unleash something at me, but the officers pressed her forward and steered her toward a waiting cruiser. She was folded inside, head dipping low under the roofline, and the heavy door swung shut on whatever she was still saying. Then came Beckett. He emerged slowly, no resistance in him. He moved like a man being walked to the gallows, each step deliberate and resigned. His tuxedo jacket had disappeared somewhere in the backstage chaos. His white shirt was torn and stained. He stepped into the hard glare of the police lights and blinked disoriented and hollowed out. When the officers approached, he raised his hands without being asked, a gesture of surrender that should have come 2 years earlier. "Beckett Drummond," the detective announced, reading from the warrant. "You are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, perjury, and filing a false police report." Beckett said nothing. He allowed them to pull his arms behind him. He allowed the cuffs to close. He looked like a man who had simply run out of everything. But as they walked him down the steps, his eyes moved across the gathered crowd, the investors, the socialites, the former friends who were now pointing cameras at his humiliation. And then he found me. I was standing alone near the stone birdbath at the center of the circular drive, hands in my pockets, expression giving nothing away. I was not smiling. There is no pleasure in watching your own blood be put in chains. But there is something else, something quieter and heavier, in seeing justice finally arrive. Beckett stopped. He dug his heels in, fighting against the officer, pushing him forward. "Dad!" he called out. The officers pressed harder, but he threw his weight back, desperate. "Dad, wait, please." He wrenched free from one officer's hold for just a moment, stumbling forward, dropping to his knees on the wet asphalt. He slid until he was directly in front of me, looking up, tears cutting through the sweat and grime on his face. He looked like a child, the small boy who used to come to me bleeding from scraped knees, needing someone to make it better. But that boy was gone. The man kneeling in front of me had killed him. "Dad, please!" He sobbed, his bound wrists reaching toward my hand. "End this. Tell them it was a mistake. I am your son. You cannot let them take me to prison. I will die in there." I looked down at him. The fear in his eyes was something I recognized. It was the same fear that had lived inside me every night for 730 days. The fear of the cage, the fear of being erased and forgotten. "I made a mistake," he pleaded, his voice fracturing. "I was stupid. I was weak, but I am family. You always said family protects each other. Save me, Dad. Please save me." He bent forward and pressed his forehead against the toe of my shoe, his whole body shaking with the force of his weeping. I looked out at the crowd. They were still, every one of them, watching the final act unfold. I looked at the officers who had paused and were waiting on me. They believed perhaps that the father would relent, that mercy might yet carry the day. I leaned down. I brought my face close enough that only he could hear what I said. I could smell the fear coming off of him. "I protected you for 40 years, Beckett." I said, my voice low and hard as stone. "I gave you a home. I gave you an education. I gave you a company. I taught you the difference between right and wrong. I taught you that a man's word is everything he is." Beckett looked up. A flicker of hope crossed his ruined face. "Yes," he whispered. Yes, Dad. I straightened up, standing over him. But none of it took, I said. You chose greed over everything I gave you. You chose to believe a liar, and when I stood in your way, you had me locked up to get me out of it. I drew my foot back, breaking the point of contact between us. I moved his hand aside, deliberate, unhurried, final, a rejection that needed no words. I have taught you everything I am able to teach you, son, I said, and you failed at every turn, so now I am sending you somewhere else to learn. Beckett's eyes went wide. No, he gasped. No, Dad. Please, let the prison teach you, I said. Maybe 4 walls will show you what freedom was worth. Maybe the silence in there will teach you what truth means, because I have nothing left to give you. I looked up at the officers. Take him, Beckett screamed. It was a long, agonizing wail that split open the night. The officers seized him by the shoulders and hauled him upright. He thrashed and twisted, his eyes locked on me, full of betrayal, but I held his gaze without flinching. I watched them drag him toward the second cruiser. The press surged in flashbulbs, detonating like lightning strikes, capturing his contorted face one final time before he was pushed into the back seat. The door slammed. The lock turned. The sirens rose as both cars pulled away, their red lights bleeding into the dark, carrying off everything that had rotted inside my life. I remained where I was, the rain beginning to fall, tapping quietly against the pavement, washing it clean. The guests filtered away in clusters, murmuring to each other, none of them quite able to meet my eye. They understood now that the man standing by the stone birdbath was not merely a survivor. He was something else entirely. I drew a long breath. The air was cold and tasted clean. My son was gone. My daughter-in-law was gone. My house stood empty. But for the first time in 2 years, I did not feel alone. I had my dignity back. I had the truth. And when morning came, I had a company waiting to be rebuilt. The sun came through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the executive suite on the 42nd floor in long, clean bars of light, nothing like the gray weight that had pressed down on the city the day I walked out of that cell. The office had been put right. The rowing machine where my leather armchair used to sit was gone. The mirrors were gone. My mahogany desk stood in its proper place again, buffed to a shine that gave back the whole skyline of everything I had spent a lifetime constructing. The room smelled of fresh coffee and good leather. It smelled of order restored. I sat in my high-backed chair and worked through the final stack of documents. My hand was steady. The signature that came out was bold and sweeping, the same signature it had been 30 years ago. Across the desk sat Nadine. She was not the frightened young woman in a stained uniform anymore, hunched in a diner booth trying to disappear. She wore a tailored navy suit that fit her like it had been made for her specifically. Her hair was styled, and behind her new glasses, her eyes were sharp and alert, fully present. She was working through the quarterly projections on her tablet, navigating the screen, with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. I had named her chief financial officer 2 weeks prior. A handful of board members had registered their skepticism at her absence of corporate credentials until she turned up 3 concealed accounts that Beckett had been using to bleed the company. After that, the skepticism evaporated. She possessed the one qualification that outweighed any degree. She had integrity. I set the pen down. It was finished. The Clifford Drummond Legal Defense Fund is officially established, I said, sliding the paper across the desk. $5 million in its initial funding. It will provide first-rate legal representation for elderly people being financially preyed upon by their own families. No one should have to rot in a cell because their children are impatient for an inheritance. Nadine picked up the document and smiled, not a polished, practiced smile, but a real one that made it all the way to her eyes. It's going to change a great many lives, Clifford, she said. I've already brought on 3 attorneys from the district attorney's office to lead the team. They begin on Monday. Good, I said, easing back in the chair. And how is Cody? He loves the new school. She said, her whole face shifting the way faces do when the subject is someone you love without reservation. He asked whether Grandpa is coming to his soccer game on Saturday. Something settled in my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with money or power or any of this. Tell him I will be there, I said, and tell him I'm bringing the orange slices. The intercom on my desk cut into the moment. My assistant's voice came through, careful, hesitant. Mr. Drummond, she said, I have a collect call from the state correctional facility. It's Beckett. Would you like me to block it? I looked at the phone. The red light was blinking a slow, steady pulse like a warning signal. Nadine looked up from her tablet, her expression closing down. She didn't say a word, but I knew exactly where her mind had gone. The fear, the threats, the years of it. I held my gaze on that blinking light for a long moment. 2 years ago, I would have picked up without hesitation. I would have scrambled to clean up whatever disaster he'd created, posted bail, hired the best people, buried what needed burying. But the man who did those things was no longer here. He had died in a prison cell, and what had climbed out in his place was something else entirely. "Put him through," I said, "but leave it on speaker." A click. The automated voice informed us that the call was being recorded. Then came the sound of labored breathing, and the noise behind it, metal doors slamming, voices shouting, the ambient racket of a place built for punishment. "Dad," Beckett's voice came through thin and frayed. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here, Beckett," I said, keeping my voice level. "Oh, thank God," he broke down. "Dad, you have to help me. This place, it's a nightmare. The public defender you left me with is useless. He's telling me I'm looking at 10 to 15 years. 10 years, Dad. I'll be 50 when I walk out. You have to get me a real attorney. Get Warren, please. I know you're furious, but you can't just leave me to rot in here." I listened. I waited for something, some flicker of genuine remorse. I waited for him to ask about his child. I waited for a single word directed at Nadine, some acknowledgement of the damage he'd done. Nothing came. Only his own suffering. Only his own needs. Even in handcuffs behind bars, he was still the same self-absorbed boy who had always assumed the world existed to serve him. "I'm not angry, Beckett," I said, my tone even. "Anger assumes I was caught off guard, and I don't get caught off guard anymore." "Dad, spare me the philosophy." Beckett snapped, his voice spiking with panic. "I need money. I need an appeal filed. You're sitting on millions. Transfer something to my commissary account at a minimum. I'm hungry, Dad. The food in here is swill." I glanced at the untouched sandwich sitting at the edge of my desk. "The food is supposed to be bad, Beckett," I said. "It's prison. I ate it for 2 years. You'll adjust." "Dad, please." His voice collapsed into something raw. "I am your son. Blood is thicker than water. You used to say that yourself, you always said it." I extended my finger and held it over the disconnect button. "I did say that," I replied. "But I learned something new in the dark. Beckett, blood may be thicker than water, but it can also be poisonous. And when a limb is gangrenous, you don't keep it attached because it belongs to you. You remove it to save the rest of the body." "No, Dad, wait, don't hang up." Beckett's voice rose to a near shriek. "I already have," I said. I pressed the button. The line died. The silence that moved in to replace it was not heavy. It was not sorrowful. It was light. It carried the feeling of a pack dropped from your shoulders after a very long walk. I looked at Nadine. She was watching me with tears on her face, not grief, but understanding. "Are you all right?" she asked quietly. I pushed back my chair and crossed to the window, looking down at the city below. The cars were tiny, the people smaller still. Down there, life churned on chaotic, messy, and genuinely beautiful. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm free." I turned back to face her. "People say family is everything. They say you owe forgiveness to anyone who shares your blood, no matter what they've done to you. They say biology settles the question, but they're wrong. Family isn't a matter of whose DNA you carry. It's about who stands next to you when everything falls apart. It's about who still respects you when you have nothing left to offer. It's about who tells you the hard truth when a comfortable lie would be so much easier." I walked over and rested my hand on Nadine's shoulder. "I lost a son," I said. "A son who saw me as nothing more than a source of money. But I found a daughter who sees me as a man. And on Saturday, I'm going to sit on a sideline and watch my grandson play soccer." I let that sit for a moment. "That is a fair trade." I returned to my desk and picked up the pen. "Now," I said, "let's get back to work." And so it ended the way it had to end. Not with shouting, not with bitterness, but with a pen, a signed document, and a child asking whether Grandpa was coming to the soccer game on Saturday. This story cost Clifford 2 years of his life. 2 years of cold floors, bad food, and the particular agony of being locked away by the hand of someone he had raised. But what came out the other side was something that could not have been earned any other way: clarity. He learned who truly stood by him when he had nothing. And I believe God has a way of allowing those seasons of darkness to strip away everything false so that what is real and lasting can finally be seen. Here is what I take from a story like this, and what I hope you carry with you. First, protect your legacy in writing. A handshake and a bloodline are not enough. Documents matter. Second, when someone shows you who they are, even if they are family, believe them the first time, not the fifth. Third, loyalty is not inherited. It is demonstrated quietly over time by people who may not share your last name. Fourth, if betrayal comes for you, do not waste your energy on anger. Use it on preparation. Let justice do the rest. Stories like this one, Grandpa Revenge stories, built on real pain and hard-earned wisdom, exist because so many people have lived something close to them and never heard their experience named out loud. If these father stories speak to something in your own life, I hope this one reminded you that it is never too late to reclaim what is yours. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you. If you know someone who needs to hear it, pass it along. Sometimes one story is enough to shift something in a person. And if you have not already subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one.